Hello everyone. Okay, I hope we're all well and happy. Today I'm going to do the last lesson of the academic year for Russia, which is on Khrushchev and how Khrushchev treated the peasants and agriculture. Before I do that, I'm going to just go over the bit about Stalin from the previous lesson to make sure we're all kind of happy with that. It does involve quite a big PowerPoint on the Khrushchev stuff, so it might end up being two videos because it only lets me record 15 minutes per session. So, Stalin then, let's just quickly make sure we're all happy with Stalin, because it does link into the Khrushchev stuff anyway and why he made some reforms. So, Stalin, as we know, his big policy was collectivization. The idea that the peasants with their private land holdings would be abolished. He'd create these like supermassive farms, and all the peasants who worked on those previously small farm holdings on the same land would be turfed off and they'd work for this collective farm. There are really two main reasons why Stalin kind of did this. One is ideological, which is pretty true, most things Stalin did, and one is kind of practical. So we'll do the practical one first. So I think as a basis, because Stalin recognised that for Russia to fully industrialise and compete with the West, which is his main aim, because he believed unless Russia was as strong as the West, it could always be vulnerable to being invaded and taken over, was Russia needed to grow more food. If Russia's going to industrialise, with heavy industry, big cities, big towns, then obviously those people can't grow food. Therefore, you need the farming to produce enough food in order for Russia to industrialise. So that was one of his main plans behind this. So bigger farms equals more efficient farms equals more food. Okay. Again, there's some links there with Stolypin, isn't there? This idea that farms, should kind of amalgamate, create bigger farms which can produce more food. Only Stalin went a whole range further with his forcing the peasants into these collective farms, etc., etc. The other reason Stalin did was ideological. And there's two strands for this. One of them was to get rid of the kulaks. Now, the kulaks, as I'm sure you've kind of come across, were these richer peasants. I suppose they were kind of the products of Stolypin's reforms, these more entrepreneurial peasants, the ones that had new ideas about what to grow, these peasants who were more linked towards the market forces, and they became wealthier as a result, and they bought the land through those land banks, etc., etc. Now, Lenin wasn't a great fan of these people either, because he believed they were a threat to Bolshevism. Stalin, the same. And so most of the kulaks resisted collectivization, and most of them were either sent to Siberia or had a bullet in their brains. Okay? And so you saw the kulaks being systematically removed by Stalin in 1929-1930. And the other ideological reason why Stalin did this was to control the peasants, because these collective farms were not free. They were basically told what they had to grow. So they each had targets. So, for example, a bit of a blast of wind. So they each had targets. So we expect your farm to produce X amount of maize or X amount of wheat or whatever. And the state will buy them off the collective farm. So in that respect, they were still private. The state bought them, but at below the cost of production very often. So say, for example, I don't know, it costs £10 to grow a field full of carrots. Well, the state would buy them off the collective farms for like £9.50 or £9. So it kept the peasants poor. Okay? Also, by having these rigorous kind of targets, it meant the peasants didn't have time to grow other things. Now, they were allowed their own private plots on collective farms, but anything they sold off those private plots was taxed really heavily. Anything which the collective farm produced above their target, which they were then able to sell for extra money, was also very heavily taxed. And so Stalin's reforms really had a couple of big consequences. One was this great big famine, 1929-1930s, okay, particularly affected the Ukraine. Again, it was partly down to weather conditions, but it was also down to the death or removal of the kulaks, so the peasants lost their expertise. Okay, so you basically had the duck peasants, if you like, kind of growing the food. Also, many peasants resisted what Stalin was trying to do, and therefore were not inclined to produce the targets and the food which they were told to produce. And so Stalin, from that reading, he basically let them die, didn't he? He didn't really give a flying monkeys, did he, about them, essentially. Other consequences was there's lots of expertise, so basically you had the less good farmers who kind of took over, and also there's no incentive to produce more food or different types of food. And so the fact you got taxed really heavily if you grew more than the surplus meant you just grew the surplus. So once you met the surplus, once you met the quota of wheat, then why produce any more? Let the rest of it just die in the fields. And so you have these sorts of problems. So these problems remain throughout Stalin's period. Okay, there was no incentive to grow extra food. There was no incentive to experiment with new crops, and there was this loss of expertise. So when Stalin died in 1953, Khrushchev, who takes over, sees a really big need to try and do something about agriculture. And so I've got this PowerPoint on this. It's quite a long one, so I was looking at the time. We'll probably end up being on 2 videos. So I'll do the first half on this one, second on the next one. Okay then, so Khrushchev and agriculture. Well, the first thing to understand about Khrushchev, he was actually from peasant stock himself. Okay, he came from the Ukraine, which is a real big part of Russian agricultural area. And as a consequence, he kind of believed himself to be an expert in agriculture, which he wasn't. Okay, I don't think he would ever grown anything himself in his life, but he believed himself to be an expert. Okay, now the thing with Khrushchev and his reforms were well, one thing he gets accused of sometimes is not really thinking through his policies properly. He was also up against some really big vested interests. So all the reforms he made, he couldn't do with spending lots of money, because there were too many vested interests in producing heavy industry. A lot of the Bolsheviks under Lenin, the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party were involved in heavy industry. The state owned a lot of heavy industry. And so lots of vested interest in that. And then secondly, the military complex, this need to compete with the West militarily, producing all these missiles, Sputnik and the space race, etc., etc. So all the reforms Khrushchev kind of made were kind of done in that kind of context. There were lots of vested interests, there was not a great deal of money, but he believed himself to be a friend of the peasants and the countryside, basically, and he was keen to make some reforms which had varying degrees of success, shall we say. So the first thing then is Stalin's legacy. Okay, when it changes, here we go. So there's a picture, piece of propaganda from Stalin's time, which shows all these kind of happy peasants sowing the land. You've got these kind of tractors behind them. Most of the peasants, as we know, worked on something called the kolkhozy. These were the collective farms, but they were essentially private. They were not state employees. Therefore, the peasants did not get the benefits of state employees, i.e. the pensions, for example, and these various other kind of benefits. Okay, as I said before, the state bought all agricultural produce from these collective farms, but often at below the cost of production, which led to cheap food in the cities, which the government were really keen on. You know, Stalin was really keen that food should be really cheap in the cities for his industrial workers. And actually we know the dangers of the cost of food going up, because that uprising against Khrushchev in 1962 in Novorossiysk, it was called, was kind of triggered by increasing food prices around that sort of time. So cheap food was really important, hence why the state bought food really cheap off these collective farms, and they had no choice over it. But of course that then left the peasants being really poor. As I said before, any surplus food which the collective farms produced was taxed extremely highly, so there's a disincentive. And then MTS charged high amounts for leasing of equipment. Now MTS stands for Machine Tractor Stations, and essentially what they were was that let's say that Nuneaton has a collective farm, let's say that Bedworth has a collective farm, and let's say that Hinckley has a collective farm. Well, the machine tractor stations, basically, they would own all the equipment. So let's say the machine tractor station is located on Nuneaton. They would have all the kind of tractors and ploughs and fertilising machines, all that kind of stuff owned by the state. These are state-owned assets, and what they would do is that they would lease them to the collective farm. So let's say the Hinckley collective farm needs 5 tractors because they want to, I don't know, do whatever it is to do with tractors. Okay, they'll go to the machine tractor station and say, can we please lease 5 tractors? The machine tractor station people say, yes you can. Okay, here are your 5 tractors. They'll charge them for it. Okay, and then the Hinckley collective farm would use those 5 tractors. Let's say the Nuneaton collective farm says, can we have some fertiliser spreading machine? Okay, the machine tractor station say, yep, here it is, you know, £10 an hour or whatever, off you go. So these machine tractor stations is where the machines were kept, and again they charge high amounts for leasing out this equipment. So again, that ensures that the peasants are kept poor. Basically, it makes the cost of production relatively high. We know the state's buying it for less than that, against a means of control, you might argue. And so as a consequence, most peasants lived in extreme poverty, very similar conditions to what they lived in before the revolution. Okay, those pictures we saw of the peasants and Alexander II and third time, you know, around that one wooden hut, living with the pigs and stuff. Well, actually, if you went to Russia in 1935, 1940s even, okay, went to the peasants' area, you'd probably find the peasants living in not dissimilar kind of conditions. Compare that to farmers in the West, for example, much wealthier. So, what did Khrushchev actually do, okay, to try and resolve some of these problems and improve life? The one thing Khrushchev was very keen to do for industrial workers and also for agricultural workers was to improve people's living and working conditions. He believed that communism would not really be successful unless people felt the material benefits from it. So in the West at this time, people are getting fridges and people are getting TVs and all that kind of stuff. He was very keen that in the Soviet Union, if communism was to be a success and for people to really support communism, then it had to produce the goods for the Russian people as well. So one thing he did, he cut taxes from collective farms. Okay, and he especially made sure that taxes were cut from goods produced from the private plots of those collective farms. So he's trying to create an incentive here for collective farms to grow more food. Perhaps on those private plots they might want to experiment a bit and grow some different types of food. So he was trying to create an incentive for the collective farms to produce more food, rather than the disincentive of, you've grown X% more than what you should have done, we're going to tax you 55% for it. Okay, he did increase the amount which the state paid for agricultural produce, but only by a fairly small amount. So no longer was it below the cost of production, but it wasn't really much more than the cost of production. And again, one reason why perhaps it was only a small amount which the increased payment was because obviously a lot of money for Russia at this time was being spent on the military and heavy industry. Therefore, it did not have that much money to spare in order to pay for extra food costs. Okay, so why couldn't Khrushchev pay more? Like I just said, he was using it for the military mainly and for heavy industry. Okay, he also tried to convert as many of these private collective farms, the kolkhozy, into something called the sovkhozy. These are basically state-owned collective farms, and by doing that, it meant the peasants would then become state employees and therefore would benefit from things like state pensions and state other kind of benefits. So he's trying to improve the lot of the peasants by making them state employees, so they'd lose their private kind of, they weren't really private really with these collective farms, but they'd lose some of their kind of privateness of these collective farms. They'd become state employees, but at least they would gain from that in terms of pensions and all that kind of business. And he was also very keen on producing new towns as well, which were for agriculture. And he was very keen to build these new flats for peasants to live in. Okay, and here's a picture of them. Again, today we're thinking horror at these flats. In fact, even today in Russia, Russia's full of these flats. Khrushchev built loads of them, not just for agricultural workers, but also for industrial workers. And they've actually got a nickname. I can't remember what it's called now. It's something like, they're basically called Khrushchev flats. But they gave, at least for the first time for these peasants, they had their own private apartments. You know, with from the modern facilities in there, like a bath and a toilet, for example, a little